So good morning, everyone. My name is Albert A. Palacios, and I am the Digital Scholarship Coordinator here at Lilas Benson Latin American Studies and Collections at the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you for joining us today for our fall installment of the Lilas Benson Digital Scholarship in the Americas Speaker Series. Each year, the Lilas Benson Digital Scholarship Office showcases the work of scholars who are engaging digital lenses to innovate scholarship on Latin American, U.S. Latina, of African diaspora, and indigenous studies. Today, I have the great pleasure to introduce Dr. Helena Suárez Val, who leads Feminicidio Uruguay, a project dedicated to monitoring, recording, and mapping cases of feminicide in that country. She also co-leads Data Against Feminicide, an international participatory action research project that explores and supports activist engagements with data to end gender-related violence. Dr. Helena Suárez Val is an activist researcher working at the junction of feminism and technology. She holds a PhD in interdisciplinary studies from the Center for Interdisciplinary Methodologies at the University of Warwick, and a Master's of Arts in Gender, Media, and Culture from Goldsmiths University of London. Her research traverses digital humanities, science and technology studies, and media studies. Professionally, she has an extensive career in web development and digital communications from human rights and international and local NGOs. She is also currently an associate professor at the Digital Humanities Lab at the Universidad Tecnológica del Uruguay, and is member of Uruguay's National System of Researchers. And without further ado, I'll hand over the metaphorical microphone to Dr. Helena Suárez Val to share her work with us.
Thank you, Albert. Gosh, I'm exhausted to read everything I do sometimes. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you everybody for coming today. It's great to see so many people. Some of you I know, so thank you for coming to see me again. And some of you I don't know. It's great to see that people are coming and joining from all over. I'm going to be talking today about strategic datification and feminicide in Latin America. And you can ask questions in the chat if there's anything that I'm saying, if I'm going too fast, or if you want to, leave a question for later. I'm sure Albert will be, making sure that he's keeping track of that. But I like dialogue, so I'm looking forward to talking to you guys through the presentation or afterwards once I'm finished. So I'm going to start today by just sharing a little bit about the definition of feminicide, because this is not necessarily something that we might all be familiar with. Feminicide is a concept that names gender-related violent deaths of women. So this is killing of women, girls, cis and trans, who where the violence is motivated by gender as a reason for the violence to occur, and where the vulnerability of women in the context of a patriarchal societies leaves us exposed to this particular form of violence, which is different to the form of violence that affect also men. So it's gender-related violent deaths of women. Of course, it's a subject that is very hard to listen to and to hear about. So if you have any concerns or any time you want to take a break from the conversation, that's fine. Just make sure that you're looking after yourself. So feminicide is a global problem. It's not a problem that only occurs in Latin America, although the term feminicide is very Latin American. It's feminicidio. The term feminicide. The term femicide originated in English through the work of Diane Russell. But in the 90s, a Mexican scholar called Marcela Lagarde y de los Ríos asked Diane to translate the term femicide into Spanish through the translation of a book called Femicide, The Politics of Women Killing. And Lagarde decided to add an extra syllable. The reason for adding that extra syllable was to emphasize the gender relatedness, so that it couldn't just be understood as a simple contraposition between homicide, the murder of a man, femicide, the murder of a woman. What was interesting there is that these particular kinds of murders would be gender related. And also she wanted to create this different word to signal the responsibility of states in the fight against feminicide, because states have a right to guarantee all its citizens a life free of violence, and in particular, they need to take specific steps to guarantee women and girls, cis and trans, a life free of gender-related violence. So this is a concept that I'm going to be working with today, and I'm going to be talking about the production of data around this concept and the idea of digital data as well. So like I said, feminicide relates to gender-related murders of women and girls. It includes cis and trans women. And in order to understand it, it requires an intersectional approach. It's not only a case of looking at the gender motivation, but understanding how gender interacts with other forms of oppression, such as racism, classism, ableism, discrimination because of gender orientation, and so on. So it's important to kind of consider that gender is a motivating factor for these kinds of for this kind of violence, but it's also in interaction with other forms of oppression. And like I said before, when we use the term feminicide, we're specifically emphasizing and situating this form of violence as a human rights violation, and human rights are the responsibility of states to guarantee, right? So this is what I was saying about the responsibility of states in order to secure a life free of gender-related violence. Now, in 2015, so just shy of 10 years ago, the UN Special Rapporteur for gender-related violence called on all member states to have feminicide observatories. So this was a recognition that data about this phenomenon was scarce, or it was inadequate. It wasn't giving a full picture of what was or what the situation was. It's very patchy. And so this is the situation. 10 years ago, we have this concept that has already entered international bodies. So it's not just a name used in academia. It's not just a name used in activism, but it's also entered legislation. In Latin America in particular, all countries except for Haiti and Cuba currently have some form of legislation that recognizes femicide or the use of the term feminicide. Either it depends on the country which of the two terms they use. But as you can see in this image, it's also an activist term. It's a term that has been really taken up by Latin American feminist movement to rally to demand that this right to a life free of gender-related violence is upheld by governments, by institutions, and by society, because we all, of course, have a responsibility. This image that you see here is an image from the Ni Una Menos demonstration that also happened in 2015. Although it's not related to the UN, it's an independent movement that surged from Argentina following a specific case of feminicide, which shifted the whole kind of feminist movement and women's movement, and we took to the streets, and some of you may have participated in Ni Una Menos demonstrations because they were replicated around the world around June, and then they continued to take place every year since then. So we have the situation, we have the term in legislation, we have this very active feminist movement asking for the recognition of this form of violence by using this name. And we have the call for the production of data. Now, the reason the UN called for the production of data is because, like I said, it's patchy, it's incomplete, in some cases it doesn't exist at all. As Albert said in his introduction, I am part of a project called Data Against Feminicide. And this project is an action research project where we're trying to understand, support, and strengthen the community of practice of activists who are making feminicide data. And what we found in this project is that there were over 180 feminicide data projects around the world, and that many of those started in the last decade. So you can see in that graph shows the number of projects that started in a particular year. This timeline starts very early on in 1979, with the Combahee River Collective marches to protect the murders of Black women, which they were then recording. So this is a very early example of recording feminicide data. In the 80s and 90s, the main mobilizations were happening in Ciudad Juárez, where families, mothers of women and girls who had been murdered in that city or disappeared in that city, started to kind of gather together to demand justice. And in Ciudad Juárez, we have the work of Elizabeth Chavez, who was one of the first ones in that country to start recording feminicide data. When I say recording, I mean sometimes in notepads, sometimes using other kind of, sometimes using faxes, sometimes using different forms, you know, from pen and paper to fax through email. All of these kind of movements happen. And what you see in that graph is you see like a massive, yes, Jessica, I'm gonna get to that. Jessica writes newspapers. So what we see in the graph is that there's a spike in the number of projects that appear, and that tends to happen after 2015. So what happened there? Well, you have the Ni Una Menos movement, you have the UN, you have the fact that many more countries now have legislation around feminicide that's supporting this kind of consciousness that this is an issue that needs to be observed and understood. But you also have the advent of easy to use free technology that enables the work of recording data. And as Jessica notes in the chat, one of the main ways in which these over 180 projects that we found collect data, the sources for most of these projects are news media. So most of the projects collect information about cases that are reported in the news. They use Google Sheets or other spreadsheets or databases to record them. They use different kind of, different tools to visualize, like infographics, or they use maps. And this has to do with the strengthening of that term, the strengthening of that activism, but also the technological facilitation that can happen with the advent of these new technologies. Right, so in this map, what we're seeing is the distribution of some of the projects that we found. And this is just to show you, it's kind of slightly difficult to read maps. So on the one hand, you could say, oh, this map shows that most projects are in Latin America, but I would nuance that by saying, of course, those are the ones that are perhaps easier to find for researchers who are based in Latin America and the United States. It may be that in other regions, other terminology is used. So the term feminicide, like I said, is very Latin American. In Europe, femicide are starting to be used. In the United States, it's very rare to hear it, but it's starting to emerge as a term that appears on the news. But this map is, I just wanted to share it to show what kind of projects, where they are, what kind of fun. But we do see some projects in Kazakhstan, for example, where I've been Kazakhstan, sorry, where I've been working with some activists there, in Russia, and so on. So this is a methodology that's spreading around the world. This idea of making data about feminicide, using the tools available, and doing it through media monitoring, as I said before. So, hello, this is me. So I've been talking about all of this, and I know Albert introduced me, but who am I in all of this? So like Albert said, I started myself also in 2015, coincidentally, a project called Feminicide Uruguay, where I monitor the media, and every single day I monitor the media to try and find if there are new cases of feminicide. And I record them on a database, and I also record them on a map, and I make that information available through social media. And this is my contribution to activism since that time, as well as my academic studies of this form of activism. These are my two contributions to try to strengthen the feminist movement by creating this information, this data set for others in Uruguay to be able to understand the phenomenon, but also more globally, my academic work has been really concerned with trying to understand the practices of activists who make feminicide data, to be able to strengthen them and to be able to share our knowledge and learn from each other. So this is some of the ways in which my work, Feminicide Uruguay, manifests. It's a spreadsheet, like I said, it's a map, like I said, and you can also see a graph, very traditional, conventional data visualization. But the work also manifests in different ways. So for example, on the bottom right, sorry, you see an image of a feminist protest in Montevideo, the capital of Uruguay. And what the protesters have are holding are signs that have the name, the age, and the date of a woman who was murdered. And this information is gathered from my data set in some cases. So this is another way in which the data in my data set is being visualized as a protest, as a moving, shouting protest in the streets. So this is another form of data visualization in my view. And in the center, in the bottom center, what you have is an embroidery. And this is, again, another way in which data can be visualized. The piece of paper that you can see underneath the embroidery is actually a printout, cutout of one row of a data set, and then the embroidered name of a woman in the data set. So this is just to show you and to kind of start introducing you to some of the ways in which I see data and data visualization as slightly more open than the conventional ways in which we often think about it. So I include in my view these other forms of mobilizing data, mobilizing it in the streets, mobilizing it through art and craft. And all of these actions with data have been conceptualized in different ways. In recent years, it's been a real interest in data from activists and from scholars. And now this interest is moving into AI, but as we all know, AI has data on its base, so the interest in data is still there. And so there have been in recent years quite a few concepts that emerged to name activist engagements with data. So the form of activism that I've just described, when activists decide that using data is one of the ways in which they will do their struggle for justice or for social change. So some of these concepts are, for example, citizen data. There's also data activism, which is probably the one that has got the most traction, and the one that you might hear more frequently. There's also the name counter data, proposed by Ignacio and Klein, following other scholars who use the term to talk about mapping and the creation of, yes, there's stat activism will be the one. Ian saying, big fan, yes. So stat activism has also in that regard. And there's also one of the most recent ones that I found. I'm always trying to find new terms to try and understand my own practice as well. The most recent one I found is Datafication crítica, so critical datification, from a couple of Latin American scholars. So all of these terms are really, really useful, and they speak to the ways in which activists engage with data, the ways in which data can be mobilized for social change. The one that I probably identify with the most, apart from the one that I'm going to tell you about in a minute, is counter data, because that comes out of Ignacio and Klein's book called Data Feminism, which you might have heard about. And when that book came out, talking about a set of principles, it was a proposal for a set of principles to do feminist data science, I found myself quite identified with those principles and with the ways in which Ignacio and Klein were proposing a feminist data science could be made. And so counter data in that sense is one of the names that I found most interesting at the time. And this refers to the ways in which activists faced with a lack or a neglect of data by other actors who could be making such data, we start producing our own data. So counter data would be data that are made in response to missing data, to data that have been neglected or are not even being made by actors who could be making it. And this is data which could make a significant difference in the life of oppressed peoples. All of these terms are really, really useful, and I invite you to engage with them all if you haven't. But as an activist who engages with data, I found that they weren't hitting the spot, let's say, because they, for example, emphasize data quite a lot. You know, so they're adjectivizing data is citizen data or counter data or critical data. Or they're doing something to do with activism, but they're not really, in my view, they were not really talking about the action. The only one that is an exception to that is the last one, which is, in my view, starts to talk about the action that is involved in engaging with data as an activist, which is the action of datification. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So to me, these terms are all really useful. I don't contest them with my proposal, but I felt like I wanted something else to name the practices of engaging with data that I was engaging with, and so many others were engaging with in relation to feminicide. So with that, I came to this definition of a concept I call strategic datification. So my definition of strategic datification would be those collective or individual practices of transforming human lives and deaths into data, where the aim is to mobilize the epistemic hegemony of data to achieve a social change objective. And all of this is done with a full awareness of the dangers and limitations of using the master's tool. And the master's tools would be data. So I'll just say that slowly again. So it's collective or individual practices. I work alone as an activist doing my project Feminicide, right? But many others do it in collective endeavors or through, some do them through organizations such as universities or NGOs. Some do them as loosely organized collectives. There's many ways in which the organization of these practices happen. And what the practice is transforming human lives and deaths into data. So this is the action of datafication, of transforming human lives and deaths into data. And the aim here is to mobilize the epistemic hegemony of data. The epistemic hegemony of data, that means the fact that data are considered to be a legitimate language to explain a social issue. Much more legitimate, for example, than a qualitative approach. So if I'm talking to a policymaker and I give them photographs and narratives, it's less legitimate to justify that there is a social issue than if I show them graphs and data, especially if it's big data, that can back my argument. So there is an epistemic hegemony of data that is being mobilized to achieve a social change objective. And the last bit is quite important, which is that we do so with a full awareness of the dangers and limitations of using data. So we're not naive. This is not a practice that is naive to the difficulties of using data, and I will go into that in a minute. So this is my proposal as a complement or addition to the concepts that I showed before, to think about strategic datafication, which puts practice at the center of what's going on, datafication, the action of turning human lives and deaths into data, and that emphasizes that it should be strategic. It's not any practice, it's a practice with a specific objective. The inspiration for my term, some of you may have already realized, is the concept of strategic essentialism coined by Gayatri Spivak in 1984. Gayatri Spivak, again, an amazing scholar. If you haven't read her, you should. She's a philosopher. And in the 80s, she talked about this idea of strategic essentialism in the context of a debate that was happening in feminism and broader circles related to constructivism, to social constructivism. And the notion of essentialism refers to the belief that members of a given group have essential or natural traits. So, for example, all women are, all men are, Black people are. Like, these groups might have natural characteristics that are genetic, that come from elsewhere, that are undeniable, and all members of the group share those characteristics. That's essentialist thinking. And so, of course, essentialism is something that feminists and other social change activists often push back against. You know, we want to push back against the idea that there is a natural difference between human beings that justifies their oppression. Because there may well be natural differences, and that's okay, but not when they're used to justify the oppression of that given group. But what Gayatri Spivak says is that while it is necessary to challenge this discourse, strategically we cannot, she said. And the reason she said that is because she claimed it was strategic to sometimes assume the identity that was given as a space from which we could mobilize. What does this mean? So we could say, if we're thinking about gender, we could be aiming for a world where gender doesn't exist as a category, for example. This could be our end goal. I'm not saying it should be, I'm just saying as an example, this could be an end goal, that gender doesn't exist. So we could start today from gender doesn't exist, or we could start from there are women, there are men, these are the categories that are assigned by a system of oppression, but we can take those categories to mobilize for women, to mobilize for men. So in some ways, what she's saying is that there may be political outcomes to be gained by leveraging these essentialist categories. Sometimes, when it is strategic, right? So when there is an objective that will be best served by assuming that identity, then what Gayatri Spivak said at the time was that it would be strategic to do so. that leaves all sorts of tensions hanging around. You know, what does it mean when we assume a category that is the cause of our own oppression, or what we assume then when we're using the master's tools, to use Audre words, to try and dismantle the master's house. So these tensions were inherent in this idea of strategic essentialism, which means taking up those difficult, oppressive categories, but using them for a strategic purpose. And here I also want to kind of link it to data, because data, of course, has played and continues to play a really important role in this idea of essentializing oppressed groups. For example, one can think about the way in which measurements of skulls in colonial times were used to justify racism, right? So there was a whole science, a whole data science of measuring skulls and measuring bones and measuring different aspects of the human body to justify racist oppression. So this idea of data as an agent of oppression is already embedded in that. So with this in mind, this is why this idea of engaging with an oppressive tool for strategic purposes echoed with me when I was thinking about my own practice and the practices of other activists who engage with data. And why do I make this link? Because what is datification? Well, like I said, it's a process of turning human lives and deaths into data. The definition of Meyer, Schoenberg, and Cookier is the action of transforming any phenomenon into data format. And as Lurs reminds us, though, data is a technology of vision and surveillance that has been historically linked to imperialism and colonialism, like I just said. It's also linked to the military-industrial complex, to capitalism, and to the cultural attributes of masculinity. This last part relates to this idea that when we think about gender as it is assigned from the point of view of oppression, we have rational, emotional, in different parts of the binary, and of course you would have data and narrative, for example, as two counterposed sides on this side of the narrative. So the cultural attributes of masculinity are those that are given the most priority, and it would be rationality, data, and so on. So we could say, okay, data is bad. Let's not touch data with a barge pole. Let's not do anything with data. We also worry a lot, those of us who are making data, about, for example, the homogenizing requirements of making data. What does it mean to work with data and to work with feminicide when we are actually transforming the lives of women who had dreams, who had hopes, who had communities, who had lives, who had a humanity? What happens when we then transform them into a row in a data set, into a number in a chart, and so on? So we could say, okay, let's not do data at all. It's too dangerous. It's the possibility of dehumanizing, of re-victimizing, the possibility of flattening human lives is too, the risk is too high. Or we could say, well, what about if we do this strategically? We know data is part of the language of power. So what happens if we decide to mobilize that language in a way that is more strategic to our objectives of social change? And this is, and there is, of course, a lot of arguments in support of this. So, for example, these two scholars, Latin American scholars, Tironi and Valderrama, support themselves on the work of Paulo Freire, the well-known scholar, Brazilian scholar who works on the pedagogy of the oppressed. And they say that data has a pedagogical potential to prompt oppressed peoples to start asking why. So this has to do with this ability of data to kind of connect dots in ways that perhaps other forms of language cannot connect so easily. So like I said, we could say, okay, let's engage with data when it is strategic to do so. If we do engage with data in a strategic way, then it should be temporal, contextual, situated, and critical practice. What this means is we don't just do data, we do data during a specific time and for a specific objective and in a specific context. So it's not the same type of data or even data process for making data that I'm going to engage with in Uruguay as I might do in the United States. It should also be strategically aimed to a particular audience. Like I said, data is very powerful language because it has epistemic dominance. But and so we should be thinking about how and which audiences we want to connect with when we're making data. Another way in which datification can be engaged strategically is by ensuring that it helps us make use of our resources. So many of the 180 projects that I talked about in the beginning are volunteer, unpaid, honorary, or have very few resources. So in some cases, making data is the most strategic form of activism that we can engage with. In my case, for example, this was particularly the case because I had the skills. I used to work with databases. I used to work with datasets. I knew what I was doing with data. It was something that I was comfortable with as a format, and therefore it made sense for me to engage in that as a good use of my resources. Like I said before, it should be time bound. No strategy is infinite. Strategy has to be to achieve an objective by when. And like I said at the beginning, it's super important that it's aware of the dangers and limitations implicit in datification I mentioned before. Now, in some ways, you could say anybody can do strategic datification because anybody with a social change goal can engage with data strategically to achieve that goal. And that means it doesn't necessarily, I think it's always really important to think it's not just activists for the good. We do know of examples, for example, of anti-rights activists using abortion data, what's it called? Turning around abortion data and creating fake or misleading visualizations in order to promote anti-abortion rights activism. So when I say strategic datification, it's I'm referring to a form of using data, but not necessarily to what the objective is. Now, what I'm talking about when I'm talking about strategic datification with feminicide is a strategic datification that centers care. In this form of activism, activists, we get involved in the strategic datification as a part of a feminist politics of committing, of preoccupying ourselves, of making ourselves concerned with feminicide through the production of data. And in this way, this becomes a knowledge-making practice that involves, of course, the labor of creating, maintaining data sets, so the material labor of actually working with data, but it also involves very profound, affective, and ethico-political commitments. So when we're doing these practices, we are very strongly relating to the women whose lives we are datifying, to the communities and families that are linked to these women, and we're also committing ethically and politically to change the world, to create a world in which gender-related violence doesn't exist, to create a world in which we no longer need to engage in strategic datification. The last thing I wanted to leave you with is a particular form of strategic datification that I think is really interesting, which is something that my colleagues and I have called data artivism. And these are works that intervene in the visual contestation around an issue by mobilizing arts and craft as a form of resistance and as a form of visualizing data, so as a form of data visualization. So again, I'll just say that these are works that intervene in the visual contestation around an issue, so in how that issue is seen and perceived by society, by using arts and crafts to resist stereotypical or hegemonic representations, to change the script, as it were, in a particular way. Here, arts and crafts become a form of data visualization. And I'll leave you with these 3 examples. So in the center, you see a slightly longer version of the banner that I introduced in the beginning. It's an embroidered banner made up of the names for a whole year in the database Feminicide Uruguay, and it created a 10-meter-long banner that was installed in a public square during a International Women's Day demonstration in the capital city, and has been taken elsewhere since then. On the right, you have a visualization that is in the Zócalo of Mexico, so that's the main square in the capital of Mexico, and it's graffiti of, again, the names of a whole year of women who were murdered in cases of feminicide. They didn't have enough time to do all of it, so these are just some of the names for that year, and it was a collective graffiti where the Colectiva SJF, the artists, invited people to engage with this. And on the left, you have the work of No Estamos Todas, a collective who invites illustrators to engage with data about cases of feminicide and to create an illustration that imagines that woman as she was when she was alive. And this is, the idea is to counter representations of sensationalist representations that focus on deaths and on the women's deaths and leave them fixed in that role of being victims. So these are 3 different ways in which you can think about visualizing data. And I think what I hope to do by showing you this is to inspire you to think a little bit more about different ways in which you can mobilize data, and thinking about digital humanities, which is the context in which we are now. Like, think about different ways in which data can be visualized and in which these archives of information can be used and mobilized for social change. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Helena, for definitely, at least for me, you helped me work through quite a few. I learned a lot of concepts, that's for sure. But then also just thinking, you walking us through your thought process and how you're bringing in different frameworks, right, to be able to find one that works for you has been, at least for me, very illuminating. Also the different examples you've talked about, and thank you again for defining a lot of these terms. It's been really fruitful for me. I do want to open it up to the audience, so for any questions that they might have about the concepts that you talked about, but then also about your work. You're free to, you can add your question to the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question directly. But I invite you at this point to share your questions with us.
I just need 1 second because
Yeah.
I got somebody at the door, but second, I'm back. Don't say any questions.
Yes. Again, you can add it to the chat if you prefer, or when Dr. Helena Suárez comes back, you can unmute yourself and share that question with her. All right, we have one from Ian. Yes, and that's a great way. If you can raise up your hand, that way we can go in that order.
I'm back. I'm sorry.
All right, Dr. Suárez, we have one question from Ian Williams. Ian, if you want to unmute yourself and share that question.
Sure. First, I just want to say I really love this talk. Very inspirational and very nice to see like your creative thinking. And I have not thought about strategic essentialism in a long time, but like it fits really well, and it fits really well in this kind of puzzle of what to do with the digital. So I think one of my questions, I think of this recent, very interesting exhibit I went to in New York at Cooper Union. It was called Hello from the Data Vandals, and it's this kind of data
Mm,
art activist group that was synthesizing multiple forms of data and archival material. A lot of it focused around, I think, making administrative data and data about the city of New York kind of more fun and interesting. And I really liked it. And I also noticed the trend within data visualization design culture sometimes to like not challenge some of the epistemological foundations of data science itself or design. And so
mhm.
within this strategic piece and then within other kind of artistic traditions, I think as well about like avant-garde artists or, I think even like Dadaists, right, where destruction of the archive or destruction of the material thing is part of pushing against, the otherwise like dominant trends, which particularly now is just to like catalog, contain, control, and then with the shift from data to AI, it then becomes the training base for everything, right? So how do
Yes.
you see navigating that, particularly within artistic practices?
Oof. I've been really thinking a lot about this, and at the moment, what I'm thinking about is it's like the other way around. I'm trying because of this thing about using the language of power, and I'm actually maybe being a bit sneaky and trying to think of what if we think about this artistic invitation in interventions as data. So, for example, there are a lot of interventions related to feminicide, like you may have seen some of them. One of them involves placing red shoes in public spaces to represent dead women, and of course that's data. Then you have others where there's performances where women drop onto the ground. And so I don't know, I'm trying to kind of think about what happens if I use this language of data to describe artistic practices in order to challenge it the other way around. I don't know. I don't have an answer. So I'm just kind of speaking what came to my mind when I was listening to you. The other thing I've been thinking a lot about this AI thing, because as part of the Data Against Feminicide project, we actually have developed a machine learning tool, and we're hoping to develop an LLM-based tool. So the first one was just machine learning, quite simple machine learning. The next tool that we're hoping to come up with is an LLM-based. And of course, we're going to be thinking of all of these things. So I guess I'll have a more rounded answer for you maybe at the end of next year after we finish this development, because we're thinking a lot about feminist AI development. Is that even a possibility? I recently read an article that discusses with the idea of feminist. My God, my Spanish brain is really kicking in. I can't think in English anymore. But data, with the idea of data feminism, saying that we should reject data completely. And I would say, well, what happens if we say no to all of it, to data, to AI? Do we not leave that space to others? Like I said, there are many strategic data fires who are not for the good. And I think what I also wanted to kind of come up with a term that would sound less optimistic, because strategic datafication sounds a bit evil, whereas data activism sounds really nice. And I feel there's a little bit of, when we say the word activism, we often think about activism for good, but there's activism to keep the status quo. There's activism, to gain advantage over different groups. So I wanted to come up with a term that sounded a bit evil and had still those tensions alive in it.
Well, thank you for thinking with my question. Really love this discussion.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you.
That was great.
We do have a comment here by Silvia Liberal Faro, who says, thanks so much. I would like to ask if you could elaborate in the difference between counter data and strategic datafication. I thought of counter data a bit as counter mapping with an epistemological goal. My question could be why you prefer to take distance from that concept, thinking that it comes from a book centered on feminism.
Yeah, like I said, I don't intend with this concept to supersede any of that. And like I said before, I totally think I'm doing counter data sometimes. I just kind of wanted something, there's many things that, first of all, I work with Catherine in the data. I didn't say that. Catherine is a co-lead with me, with Silvana Fumega, and with Isadora Crucian in the Data Against Feminicide project. And I promise you, we're not constantly arguing with each other about counter data and strategic datafication. It's more like, because when I read that book, Data Feminism, I was like, great, this is what I do. I found that something that made sense. And the whole idea of counter data did make sense. But then I wanted something that was mine, because it's my own practice. And there is something there about, and this we do talk with Catherine a lot, there's something about these concepts, except for critical datafication, in that list of concepts I showed you, they're all from the North. They all come from the North, and they all mostly focus on practices in the South. And so they're mixed, they're mixed. But I kind of was like, okay, what if I think about something else that comes from, Gayatri Spivak's thinking, this is very kind of third world or Southern thinking. So it's not like I distance myself from those. It's more in addition to think from a different perspective and with different thinkers than those concepts have been discussed. But it's not an argument or a distancing from.
Thank you. Are there any questions or any other comments? We have time for maybe one or two more. Yes, Lisa.
Can I ask a question? Hi, so this has been wonderful. Could you talk a little bit about how or if you use your work in the classroom, and how do students respond in thinking about, what strategic datafication looks like in their learning process?
Oh, Lisa, I wish. I'm at this university. I'm starting to develop this lab, the Digital Humanities Lab, but it's a very incipient project, so we don't actually teach. So I have discussed this in this kind of context and with other students, but not as a teaching tool, but I think it has a lot of potential there. Again, because Sylvia says in the chat, this idea of strategic, to me that was the differential. It's talking about datification. It immediately takes you to the practice. Like, what is that? Okay, it's something that you do that has to be done. And strategic, so I wanted to focus on practice. There's another scholar who also talks about practice as something that needs to be emphasized is Aristea Fotopoulo. I can write the name in the chat later, and Tom Wolford. Both of them thinking about how we need to think about practices. Tom Wolford talks about aesthetic practices, making data as an aesthetic practice. I think that's really great. So I was thinking with a lot of people who are thinking about the actual doing, because I'm an actual doer, but yeah, I wish I had the chance, and I hope I will. And of course, you're all welcome to use it. I'm hopefully going to bring out a chapter with this conceptualization, what I just read from you, and possibly some of your comments next year. But also, if you want to read that draft, just ask. Under pain of death.
Thank you. It sounds wonderful. I mean, I'm particularly interested in this because I like the idea of seeing programs evolve. We sort of silo some of these conversations out into just talking about digital humanities, right? But getting courses like this and these ideas really introduced in gender and women's studies courses, in literature courses and things like that, and getting students to think in this way that doesn't bifurcate math and data science from the critical and sort of humanistic thinking that you're talking about. So thank you very much.
Well, as part of the Data Against Feminicide project, Catherine this year brought us a book called Counting Feminicide, which is a synthesis of the research that we've been doing for the last 4 years. And I'm mentioning it because at the end of the book, she has a concept that it's in the slides, but I meandered and didn't mention it, which is this idea of transformative or restorative data science. Gosh, my Spanish brain, go away. So restorative or transformative data science. And then what she has at the end of the book is a toolkit for transformative or restorative data practice. Again, she came up, it's that thing of like, we're walking together along these paths, and she came up with this idea, and I came up with this other idea, and the two are completely, like, totally interlinked. But she's so much more efficient than I am, and she's got a book, and there's a toolkit there which could be really useful for working with students, I think. So, and it's open access, so you can get this. I'll put the link in the thingy.
Please do. Thank you.
Well, we are at time. Thank you very much, Dr. Helena Suárez, for sharing your work, but also just, again, thinking through or sharing with us, right, your thought process and how you're navigating these different frameworks to develop your own project, and also the co-led project that you're in charge of. I want to thank you also, the audience, for joining us today for this, the fall installment of the Digital Scholarship in the Americas speaker series. We're going to have another one in the spring, and hopefully you'll stay tuned for that one, and you can join us as well. But again, thank you again, Dr. Suárez. It's been a pleasure just hearing you. And for those of you who are interested, we will post this presentation on the UT Library's YouTube channel for you all to consult down the line. All right. But again, thank you very much. Have an excellent week. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your questions, and hope to see you soon. Stay in touch. You can ask Albert for my email if you want.
Thank you again, Dr. Suárez. Bye. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.